So I'd love to introduce our panelists. We have Michelle Huang, who is an assistant professor of English and Asian American Studies at Northwestern University. She teaches classes on Asian American literature, science fiction, and feminist theory. Her academic articles appear in venues such as the Journal of Asian American Studies and American Literature. Her film essay, INHUMAN Figures, Robots, Clones, and Aliens, is currently on exhibit online at the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center. And we have Shalini Shankar. Shalini is the Martin J. and Patricia Koldyke Outstanding Teaching Professor of Anthropology and Asian American Studies at Northwestern University. Your business card must be like double-sized. She is a 2017 Guggenheim Fellow and received research funding from the National Science Foundation, the Wenner-Gren Foundation for Anthropological Research, the Social Science Research Council, and the Spencer Foundation for Research Related to Education. She has been interviewed by a wide range of media outlets and published in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, CNN, and the LA Times. And we have Abby Eusebio, who is the Chinese American Service League's Anti-Hate Action Center manager. She focuses on implementing the goals and objectives of the center, which include tracking and responding to hate incidents, protecting AANHPI communities, and ultimately preventing further hate incidents. Ms. Eusebio brings over 16 years of both federal and state government experience. Previously, she served as a community outreach liaison for the AANHPI community in Illinois Attorney General Kwame Raoul's office and spent 14 years as a constituent advocate. Oh, you all have the mouthful names. Constituent advocate for the office of Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky. Outside of work, she has served on several boards of Chicagoland area nonprofit organizations and leadership positions that aid and empower the immigrant community and concentrate on early childhood education. So please join me in welcoming our panelists.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kristen, and thank you, Hillary, as well. I'm excited to be in conversation with you all tonight. So I think we're going to do like 45 minutes of talking and then Q&A for a conversation with you all. But I thought we could start with a really broad question to kind of help contextualize what we mean when we talk about the Asian American experience, whether we're talking about the play or more generally. So maybe could you reflect on what does Asian American mean as a term?
Great. Yeah, so I think a lot of us may have heard in the past about these different terms that we use to describe Asian Americans. So there's API, APA, so APA, Asian Pacific American, or API, Asian Pacific American Islander. But there's a new term that maybe a lot of you have heard of, but it's AANHPI. And so that stands for Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander. And recently that acronym was created to be more inclusive, to include our Native Hawaiian community. And there's also the other term, Asian Pacific Islander Desi American, so APIDA. And that purposely is a term to include South Desi or South Asian Americans as well. So there's a lot of effort to make sure that in our language, we're including a lot more inclusive terms.
You want to add on to that?
Oh, yeah, sure. I think one of the things to think about too is just how many versions of this term there are and how many times the term has been changed to basically accommodate either new people arriving or populations that were previously not counted as Asian American finally being acknowledged or kind of brought into this category. And so it's a complex category and its constitution is always changing. It's actually a category that only appeared on the US Census in 1980 for the first time. And at that time, it was very narrowly defined. So when you consider that versus the history of this country, which is relatively new as well, there's a lot of defining left to do.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, Asia is big, but you know, I think we have this idea when we say Asian American, it seems like there's this kind of amorphous shape that's maybe like East Asian American, like college age, like person or something like that. But then it's like, oh, it's actually the most diverse racial group in the country, right? It contains both the richest ethnic groups, like which are like Indian Americans, Taiwanese Americans, as well as some of the poorest ethnic groups in the country, which are like Hmong Americans, Laotian Americans. The immigration patterns, I don't know if either of you want to speak to that, are incredibly different, right? The things that brought Chinese railroad workers, which are kind of referenced within the play, are really different from the sort of post 1965 Immigration Act immigrants, which are selected for their, you know, academic achievement and such.
Yeah, I can address that
Yeah.
briefly. Prior to 1965, most of the immigration that arrived in the centuries prior came to do various types of manual labor, either to work on railroads or to do other types of agricultural work. And some were brought as indentured labor, so they were brought against their will. And that is so those communities, some of those original communities remained and eventually blended into later immigrant communities, but most kind of just intermarried with other ethnic groups, usually not whites, because there were anti-miscegenation laws that prohibited them from intermarrying with whites. So they usually intermarried with Chicanx or Mexican American communities, sometimes with Black communities. But it was really after 1965 when the US passed the Hart-Celler Act that solicited professional labor from countries, like most of the countries that sent labor were in Asia, and was really primarily China and India, and to a lesser extent, Pakistan, Korea, and a few other regions in Asia. And those immigrants are the ones that really comprise what you think of in terms of Asian America. And then again, you saw a second wave in 1990 of more STEM labor, science, technology, engineering, and math. And that is really when even more came from China and India specifically. And that is what that's kind of, those immigrants comprise the mainstay of the media representations of wealthy, successful, you've probably heard the term model minority used in, they kind of exemplify the educationally high achieving, the ones who are, you know, profiled in lawsuits against higher ed institutions, fairly or unfairly. That's a different topic, but you know, these are the ones, but they really are not emblematic of the broader Asian American community. In some ways, they're just a small portion because the community is much more diverse than that.
Definitely. And Asian Americans are the fastest growing ethnic minority in the US right now. And kind of may make sense too with India and China being the most populous countries in the world too. So it makes sense that we saw a lot of that migration from those countries and such, and we're spread, of course, across the whole country. But it'll be interesting to see the next census, kind of also how the numbers come up to of more migration and more labor, and you know, how we've grown as a community.
Absolutely. So I think, I mean, two of the things I'm hearing too are, one, you know, the category of Asian American, as Shalini kind of said, is a relatively new like phenomenon, right? Like, so even though there have been Asian people in the United States, like since for a very long time, like this category only comes into being in the 1960s as part of the student movement in California, right? So it's part of the anti-war like movement in Berkeley. It's part of the Third World Liberation Front, and that Asian American as a category, as a political identity, that is very much part of the civil rights movement, right? It's connected to kind of Black liberation there. And I think we kind of forget that because it becomes frozen as this demographic category, as if it's always existed that way. Another thing I think is, the kind of generational differences that both of you have been pointing out. So when we say like, when we think about people, new immigrants after 1965 or 1990, right? Those are first generation. So the play kind of talks about Albert's like, I'm third generation or whatever. So that's like, okay, like, so immigrants are first generation, then people, their kids who were born here, second generation, and then after that, third generation. So I think the language around generations can be pretty confusing as well. So Shalini just brought up model minorities. So, a lot of the play has to do with feeling stereotyped, unrecognized or misunderstood. I think one of the lines is like, don't put me in your tiny lacquer box or something like that. So what are some preconceptions of Asian Americans that we kind of encounter over and over?
Yeah, so there's a lot of moments in history that have affected how Asian Americans feel that they've been perceived and how they feel that they kind of can realize their full identity as Asian Americans. So such as the Japanese incarceration during World War II, aftermath 9/11, and now more recently the COVID-19 pandemic. And so a lot of these preconceptions of Asian Americans actually deal with or connected to the model minority myth. And its impact is actually really great, because the model minority myth really is the stereotype used to describe a minority group as monolithic. And when it's applied to Asian Americans, it's seen as that Asian Americans are also all just hardworking, smart, successful, kind, friendly. And, of course, that'd be great to live that kind of reputation and have that kind of image, but it actually causes a lot more damage than good, because the model minority myth also causes minority groups to be pinned up against each other. So if we as Asian Americans are seen as, this group that's always successful and very smart, we're put on this pedestal and seen as, kind of untouchable, and other minority groups may, be looked at as, well, why can't you be more like Asian Americans? And, that's far from the truth. We're not a monolithic group. We're not, all rich, crazy Asians. There's plenty of our community too that struggle to make ends meet, that are from impoverished communities. And so growing up Asian American too, our youth can really not identify with that, and it really struggled with in school, because they feel like that more expectation to live up to those expectations of being really successful in school. And not, of course, all Asian American students are smart and good in math and science. So it really does affect the mental health of Asian American youth. But specifically around the model minority myth, what causes also the issues around the perpetual foreigner stereotype as well, is because for us Asian Americans, then we are not seen as really we belong, and we are really seen as either loyal more to our home country, or where our parents are from, and we're not seen as that we belong really fully here in the US. And so that's another layer of complexity, really an issue where people are not feeling like they can actually be part of the US. They really want to be someone that they want to be seen as contributing to society, and making sure that they're seen as equals as everyone else. So those are some kind of issues that I know our community does struggle with a lot. And what particularly again with the youth, that is something that at the Anti-Hate Action Center at our Chinese American Super League, we are trying to educate people around the model minority myth, and equip educators to make sure that they're also aware of how that affects our youth.
Yeah, and I think, a lot of something my students ask me a lot is like, is it really a myth? Like, why does it feel so true then, the model minority myth, right? If there's this kind of feeling that they look around at Northwestern, a school that really is like a third Asian American or something, and are like, isn't it true that we have this like cultural thing ingrained in us that makes us hardworking and more successful? But I think, to speak again to the historical reasons that this is the case, it's not, that people in China like all work the same amount and study as hard as the Chinese Americans that are here, right? Like, it's because of the immigration law that produces a selection bias. So the population of Chinese migrants that you have after 1965 are literally 12 times more likely than Chinese people in China to have a college degree. What happens if you have college, educated immigrants who are STEM workers? You have a lot of children who therefore value education and are predisposed to go into STEM, right? Like, so I think thinking about the historical context versus the idea that this is some sort of unchanging cultural norm that people have been like computer programming since like Confucianism or something is pretty important to keep in mind. To follow up on that though, Shalini, I mean, I wonder if you could talk about your work with the spelling bee in parents. So I don't know if you want to talk about that.
Yeah, well, I
Yeah.
mean, I think that it's hard to not address the tiger in Tiger Style, right?
Yeah.
I mean, this comes from Amy Chua's Tiger Mom, the battle hymn. Is it battle hymn
The
cry?
battle hymn of the Tiger
the-
Mother.
Yeah, the
like
battle hymn
2011.
of the tiger. From that rather awful book that did spark a lot of fascinating conversation, right? And I think one of the reasons why we keep talking about it is because there's a lot in there that does resonate with patterns that we see, even though there are probably very few people who carry them out to the extremes that are described in that book. But I think, Michelle, you hit upon, the selection bias part, right? If you're selecting for people who are highly educated and, and in some cases, at least in the case of India, people who are kind of already being educated in very elite institutions that are exceedingly difficult to gain entry into. Usually these are high class individuals, they're also high caste individuals, and they are intermarrying with other high class and caste individuals. These are already elite people before they immigrate, right? And then they come to the United States. It's not that they are just arbitrarily going to push their kids to be elite in that sense, but in some ways, even though they're elite educationally, most of them don't come with reserves of inherited wealth or security. They're still coming as immigrants. They're still coming from a country that has a much weaker monetary system than the US dollar. They're coming without a huge security net. So they have to come here and hope that their children are going to find their way through the school system and, land well when they're done with college, which, as we all know, is not a foregone conclusion anymore for Generation Z and Generation Alpha. So it's a whole other project now to think about what it means to raise children. So in that context, with the parents that I worked with, kids who were in the National Spelling Bee, primarily South Asian American kids, and their and what their parents were like, and were their parents actually pushing them, or what were they doing to get their kids to continually win the spelling bee? And it was much more collaborative and much kinder than than one would think, given their winning streak. But what was really interesting was just how much anxiety there was in general about opportunity. It was not this sense of America as a land of endless opportunity. It was like, this is a really stressful place where opportunity is, you have to hustle. Nothing is being handed to you here. And so a lot of that pressure was because the idea was that you really have to work for it. And so I think it was more fostering a particular type of work ethic that got them where they were, and having that be part of what their kids had to do. And that is not something that is often taught as part of schooling in the United States, right? I mean, this is not often cultivated in the same way. So I think sometimes that gets mistook for being like an overbearing parent, right? Or being an aggressive parent. At least that's the rhetoric in my household with my children.
What is Generation Alpha?
It's what comes after Z.
Like what year is that?
After 2013 onward.
Sorry, I'm learning things too.
Babies born after 2013 are, that was, at least that's what the last time I looked, it was, they keep redefining, but
Yeah.
yes.
And I'm thinking too about how Abby sort of pointed out, not only does this conception hurt Asian Americans, right? Because then people who don't fulfill these expectations then feel like they're bad Asians is like a thing I hear a lot, right?
Yeah.
Like, oh, if I'm a bad Asian, I'm not good at math, or I'm not a good student, or whatever. Also, it obviously minimizes the achievements of people who do work hard. But Abby also alluded to the way that the model minority myth came about in the 1960s to be used against Black Americans specifically. So if you go back in history and look at the newspaper articles sort of that first articulate this idea that Asian Americans are able, especially the Japanese Americans, were able to succeed in the wake of internment, they're very explicit about this. Like I love showing them to my students because they're very literal, like that's not a little bit secret that what they're trying to do, which is like, while Black Americans are striving for more and asking for things, there's another group, Asian Americans, that are not, so it's very like thinking about racial groups in the United States. I think we always have to be thinking about racial representation in a comparative field. So if we're only thinking about Asian Americanness as exclusion from whiteness, then we're kind of missing the way that Asian American racial formation is always formed against anti-Blackness as well. But so thinking about how to represent Asian Americans then, what are some key takeaways to keep in mind when we think about the history of Asian American representation and culture and media? I mean, the play, it specifically references Mickey Rooney and his yellow face in Breakfast at Tiffany's. There's the joke about Asian Americans finally having made it because we have crazy rich Asians and all the boys now. Yeah.
Oh, you go ahead.
Okay, sure. I mean, I'm really excited to see women like Mindy Kaling producing TV shows and finally being taken seriously by networks and by Netflix, and having the kind of clout that is very difficult to gain. And I like the visibility of all of these young Asian American actors and actresses, and the ways that the roles that they're cast into are increasingly less and less archetypal, so that there's one Asian American person, so they have to represent all Asian Americans for a white gaze, versus just people being like kind of living their lives and having their ethnicity be a part of that. And you see that part, but it's not the entirety of their being. So some of you may remember a show called Fresh Off the Boat that came out, I think, in 2015. And that was the first network comedy since Margaret Cho's All-American Girl, which was like 2 decades prior. And it was a big breakthrough moment for Asian Americans, because it took that long for another network show to be put on the air. And, it had a few good seasons and it was a funny show, but it also, it was looked to be everything to everyone. It was the Asian American sitcom. And so, it was never going to accomplish that. And I think now with streaming services, you can have smaller shows that have smaller roles, and people are kind of acting out these everyday scenarios that are just not trying to, they have more inside jokes. They have, the humor in them is more subtle, and they're supposed to land with people who understand them and relate to them differently, they're not meant to land for white, kind of a white mainstream network audience. And I think this is a really huge breakthrough in representation. And I think that that's the kind of humor that is also in the play, which is, you know, something that I haven't seen before in theater.
Yeah, and it's important to celebrate these accomplishments, and you know, that gives us hope for more increased representation in the mainstream media and in art and shows and such. And but it's also on the flip side, then there's some of these statistics that show that still actually a lot of Americans, you know, don't even know, they can't even name a prominent Asian American. With a recent survey, 58% of Americans cannot name one single prominent Asian American, and 42% cannot even think of a historical experience or policy related to Asian Americans. So it's where it's they joke about it in the play, which is you know, funny, and it you know, hits it on the head that, like, great, yeah, we have these shows, but you know, it's just a couple of shows. And, you know, we, as you said, like Fresh Off the Boat is kind of like trying to be that all encompassing show, but, you know, there's so many different lived experiences from all different walks of life under the term AANHPI. You know, there's really still need to bring more stories of Native Hawaiians, Pacific Islanders, and because we are such a rich, diverse community. And so, those are, yeah, just some glaring statistics that show that we still have a lot to do to make sure we have equal representation.
And I think there's this, you know, discourse, there can only be one kind of thing, like there can only be one Asian American movie that year. There can only be one Asian American character in a show or something because of actually the burden of representation. But so what happens if there's two Asian Americans and they're different? Oh my gosh, you might have to like perceive Asian Americanness as more than one thing, right? So, I mean, I'm thinking too about like the way that the comedian Jenny Yang has this phrase representation sweats, which is like meant to capture the way Asian Americans feel when there's like the one movie or something like that, like Crazy Rich Asians. And then you feel compelled to like have an opinion on it. You feel compelled to like it because it's your one thing that you get this year or something like that. And like, what if you don't like it? Like, I don't like Crazy Rich Asians, you know, but it's still like important. I still have to think about it. But I think it's important to think about one, that Asian American mediocrity should be allowed to exist as a thing. Not everything has to be like the Asian American Black Panther, right? Like nothing is Black Panther, but also the kind of, you know, this idea of narrative plentitude, which the writer Viet Thanh Nguyen talks about, which is just to Abby's point that there's this like, we need more, like both in terms of heterogeneity and just number, and that's how you get creativity and things that are special really emerge. So I think about like, so as I just kind of dissed on Crazy Rich Asians, but it was hugely successful. It put Michelle Yeoh like really into you know, the spotlight. And I think that that allowed Everything Everywhere All at Once to kind of gain the traction that it did. And I think that's like, you know, actually an extremely creative experimental movie that wouldn't have been able to happen had there not been the mainstream success of Crazy Rich Asians. And the, you know, the lead, the dad character in Everything Everywhere All at Once was in The Goonies. Like he was like a little boy in The Goonies and then never was in anything pretty much ever again because there were so few roles for Asian American men that were just kind of like long duck dong type stereotypes. But then when he saw the script for Everything Everywhere All at Once, he was like, I could do this again. And like he re-entered and I was going to be in a Marvel movie. So just to say that on the back end, right, the production of narrative possibility, even if you don't have to like every single thing, but it's really important to develop this infrastructure of political possibility, I think. Yeah, so what about maybe the love interest like aspects of it? I mean, Jennifer kind of talks about like, you know, she's like, give me with my Asian American rom-com. I don't know if either of you have thoughts on representation, because the things referenced are Crazy Rich Asians and To All the Boys I've Loved Before. Yeah.
It's yeah, funny because she feels she needs to find a man that fits like, of course, her structure of what the perfect spouse would be, perfect partner. And so there's that scene where they're in China and she's meeting a matchmaker, and she has her whole resume of all her strengths and weaknesses. And then she's like, these are all my prerequisites, go find me, my match. But it was through that conversation with this matchmaker that she realized that, well, actually, should I actually meet this person first? Because this matchmaker is basically scheduling this wedding that week as soon as they look at their statistics and their database and find this person for her. But she realizes in this discussion with her that, wait, I should also fall in love with him. I think I should also want to be happy with him. And it's that kind of realization that, well, maybe I don't need to find my idea of my dream guy that fits in a typical rom-com. And I think that also the pressures, of course, in a lot of families, but parents are always like, tick, 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 where's my grandchildren? And so she's feeling even more of that pressure from her parents that she's in her 30s, she still hasn't been married, still doesn't have kids. And so it's feeding more into this kind of identity struggle that she's having in the play. But I think, with kind of what she sees on mainstream media, that's what she thinks that she needs. But she's realizing that, I really have to figure out who makes me happy and what makes me happy, regardless of what stereotypes are out there, what society thinks I should do. So it was kind of a revealing moment in that play, I thought.
Yeah, now listening to you talk, Abby, too, I think it's like if Crazy Rich Asians, the love interest is Asian, right? He's like Asian. And then into All the Boys, it's a white American boy. So Jennifer kind of rejecting both of those, either like the man representing, I think that really fits the play actually as sort of the negotiations, and also her trying to love herself rather than using a man from either place to fulfill her identity. So what kind of stories do you think Asian Americans need and deserve then, like in addition to the ones we have?
Well, I think you hit upon it at the end of what you said, right? I mean, in terms of like she needs to spend some time on herself, right? I mean, and not just be someone who's doing I think that the pressure is real, right? And as is, it's not just the parental pressure of the where's my grandchildren and the when are you getting married, you're ancient, kind of, especially to daughters. But I think that is actually, I think, what unites us as Asian Americans is the idea that, like, if you don't get married by a certain age, you are, really you're aging out of being of any use to society, at least from a certain parental generation,
which makes sense given the familial context of Asian American immigration.
Like make those grandchildren already, whether and that could be whether even if you're not even if you're gay, get those grandchildren from somewhere, right? Like just get the grandchildren, right? I mean, that's at least like a message from a lot of first generation parents. But I think that it's a really it's a lot on second generation and third generation young people to navigate like the whole project of like getting into college and then finishing college and then getting a job and keeping the job. Oh, and then that's when all of this marriage pressure starts, right? And so it's just a lot to navigate. And I think that maybe having someone like having a version of reality where someone could just be and do some of that self-exploration or travel or just do any number of other creative endeavors or whatever wasn't so tracked in a way that is like the next step and the next step and the next step in this very kind of capitalist like a social reproduction path of have children, get bigger house, move to better school district, all of these pre-planned steps, which I think kind of predict a certain type of social mobility and just suggest another way of being could be a really healthy model to perhaps offer as well. just some alternatives instead of saying there's just one way to do this.
Abby, do you want to add on?
Yeah, exactly. There's not just one way to do this. And I think the, for second generation, third generation Asian Americans, they feel that they have to follow kind of what their parents have taught them, what they expect of them. And you can say that about any group and community, but I think that the pressure is very much intensified when someone is very grateful for their parents' sacrifices, that they immigrated here, and you see this in the play that they finally raised Albert and Jen, that like, wow, even though our parents were like really strict, really trying to get us to do 10 million things, be the best musician, be the smartest doctor, but they realized that it is that kind of tough love, that they just wanted the best for them. But they also realized at the end that, without giving too much away, is that they want to be able to build upon those values that their parents instilled in them. And they realize that their parents have support them in that journey now of trying to figure it on their own. What makes them happy? What do they want to do in life? What are their passions? And so they come to that realization, which is probably my favorite part, because it is kind of like, I think, that message of that tiger style, the parenting, but it's really kind of the way that this built a foundation for them to be the strong people that they are. And they can now kind of they leave the nest and really realize their full identity, both as Chinese American, the Chinese part and the American part.
I'm hearing too, like, kind of intersectionality from both of what you all are saying. So like that there's not just one type of experience or one type of representational like imperative either, right? Which is what happens if you only have one show. Like, I feel like one of the things I notice is that when there's only one Asian American thing, that's often geared toward like family friendly, because they're just trying to like make something that everyone can watch or something like that. So thinking about then the possibilities in like queer Asian American stories, or things that actually showcase class diversity, right? Instead of just showing upper class or upper middle class Asian American stories in California or something like that. And then I think also interracial stories, right? So then showing Asian Americans living in community and with Latinx people, Black people, et cetera, which in history is the case, actually, like as we were kind of talking about with anti-miscegenation laws, like to Abby's point about people not being able to name an Asian American, like Kamala Harris, her name is Kamala, but people forget, because Asian Americans are not sort of visible within the sort of political history of the country. So my last question is, just thinking the last few years in the wake of COVID-related anti-Asian violence, the Atlanta spa shootings in 2020, I think there's been renewed attention to the sort of paucity of knowledge about Asian Americans. So I'm wondering, what are y'all's thoughts on how we can address that, what people can do to try to address this kind of ignorance?
Yeah, I think there's this undercurrent of increased organizing, growing of political power in the AA and HPI community. And not just as a result of the tragic Atlanta shootings, but really our community is becoming more educated, more knowledgeable and aware of these social justice issues that are affecting all generations of our community. But we saw in as the aftermath of the Atlanta shootings, that there were rallies, vigils, town halls, all about addressing and responding to the uptick in anti-Asian hate. And so, our community is really becoming more civically engaged. They, want to be able to be part of the response. They want to be part of kind of how we build our voice and our political power. And so anti-Asian hate really is a nonpartisan issue. And it's really been the catalyst, as we're coming to the midterms and the upcoming presidential election, that this is really an issue that I think our community is going to be looking to when they are looking to see who they're going to support, and what organizations that they want to work with and volunteer for possibly, and really trying to prioritize, the prevention efforts and the response efforts all around anti-Asian hate and hate incidents. So just yesterday, actually, PBS screened their documentary called Rising Against Asian Hate, One Day in March. And that was a documentary that chronicled the, aftermath of the Atlanta shootings. But in that was really a documentary that chronicled how quickly the AA and HPI community collaborated with other brown, Black communities to address violence and hate around not just our community, but of course, all communities of color. And so this is really going to be something that, I think our community is going to be looking to really follow and really get engaged with. And so, it is actually election season again. So October 24th is the first day that we can early vote here in Cook County. So, of course, make sure you exercise your right to vote. And as far as also kind of supporting organizations or working to volunteer for some groups that are kind of addressing these systemic issues. Chinese American Service League, we're always happy to have volunteers and people who want to kind of help support the work that we're doing. We've got our community engagement specialist, Kevin Amaro, here today. And so he has been working on our prevention efforts where we're really, actually, that's what we're excited about, is because we know that education is really the key to combating anti-Asian hate and hate in general, and at all ages. And so we have been actually piloting some Hate Crimes 101 workshops that Kevin has been doing with our youth in Chinatown, and we're trying to expand, of course, to the rest of the state, and also with our seniors, and just talking about what is actually hate crime, what is a hate incident, what is the difference, and where do I go to report it, what kind of help is out there, but also addressing those root causes of why there's this chronic unreporting of anti-Asian hate here in the Midwest. And so for the East Coast, the West Coast, there's a lot more data on anti-Asian hate. And so we're really trying to prioritize that at the Anti-Hate Action Center. And so with our outreach, we're trying to make sure that people know that it's okay to ask for help. It's okay to, say, I think maybe what I experienced was a hate crime or a hate incident, and maybe I should talk to someone about it, because what we need is actually that data to make sure that we have the more accurate picture of what is actually going on, what issues are communities experiencing around hate. And so that is really how we're going to be able to best provide the most comprehensive services. So we're excited about our prevention efforts there, and also at the Anti-Hate Action Center. So we do provide response. So what we do is provide that rapid response around legal consultations. We also provide mental health support with our behavioral health clinic, which we both have at the Chinese American Service League. And what we also do is make sure that we're tracking, of course, the data, because we do have a hate crimes report form on our website, which was actually modeled after stopapihate.org's website. And they did a great job at the onset of the pandemic to start tracking all these reports of verbal slurs, harassment, discrimination. And through those numbers, we're really, again, able to see more of the frequency of hate and slurs that are actually happening, and a lot in public places too. So, and in, higher education institutions as well. So it's something that we really want to make sure that we're getting the best data around, so that we can make sure that we, inform legislators and government officials about what exactly happening, because they're always asking for data. Where's the data? You're telling us all these anecdotal stories, but where's the data? So we hope that the community can join us in that effort to kind of encourage people to report and, ask for help. And so that's just a brief overview of kind of what we're doing at the Anti-Hate Action Center, but we do recommend that people encourage, your loved ones to just kind of reach out for help, or encourage the community to report if they do even think that they heard something or experienced a hate incident or hate crime. But yeah, learning really is key, because that's through our education efforts are really going to combat hate. So those are just some things and calls to action.
Yeah, and in addition to those kinds of more formal ways of addressing hate, I think thinking just about how to be an ally in smaller instances is also really important. I think a lot of things get said that maybe would be classified either as microaggressions or just straight up aggressions that aren't witnessed because they happen in non-public settings, dinner tables or just casual conversations that I think that's a great place to start ideological change in your own families, among your own friends, and especially, the pandemic's not over, and sadly, we don't know where the next variant is coming from. But it doesn't matter because one group keeps getting blamed, and every time a new variant comes out. So, I think it's being an ally is so important, it's because that initial label of the Kung flu and blaming, the Wuhan virus, like these are names that have not gone away still, and there's still things that get attached to people, and there's still things that are the basis of violent crime. So I think addressing those things, even if people are joking about them, because those jokes end up becoming the basis for more serious violent acts later, or they have the potential to. And then also just having more conversations. I think that there's the K through 12 Illinois initiative to teach Asian American studies in schools is amazing. This is a wonderful development that I don't know how long the rollout is on this, but you can talk to young people about what they're learning about Asian Americans, and that's a tremendous opportunity to engage intergenerationally on these topics. And I think just having Asian Americans not be such a marginal, exceptional part of the population, and have us be more integral to everyday life would make a huge difference.
I agree, right? It's like thinking about Asian American history, literature, culture as American history, literature, culture. It's not actually separate. Like these are part of this country and not just like a subset or category thereof, even though the way we think about race often breaks things up as if it were a completely different experience or something like that. And I think, I feel like as the English professor, I have to say, keep reading, I think it's just it's really important to find beauty and pleasure in Asian American stories and experience as well. I think it can be hard when things like Atlanta happen and we're like, oh my God, there's so much work to do here. We have to talk about the history of the Korean War and comfort women and Vietnam and all these things. But at the same time too, I think it's, and I think Tiger Style is a pretty good example of this, that Asian American experience is also full of joy. It can be very funny, even the intergenerational conflict and traumas inflicted upon us. So I encourage people to just keep consuming Asian American literature and culture and keep learning too.
Yeah, and there's just so many ways to do it, right? There's Tiger Style, there's all the Mindy Kaling stuff, there's all the boys I've loved before. I have to plug Ms. Marvel. If anyone hasn't seen it, please see it. So good, because Pakistan never gets its due, and it did in this. It's so good.
Yeah, so hopefully we more Americans will be able to name an Asian American historical experience or figure. And I'll plug a couple other suggestions for reading. So October is Filipino American History Month. And so I definitely recommend America is in the Heart by Carlos Balusan. And so it was first published in 1943. It's a semi-autobiographical classic novel by the Filipino poet Carlos Balusan, and it describes his boyhood in the Philippines and his voyage to America, and his experiences as a laborer here in America on the West Coast. And then also I Hotel by Karen Tay Yamashita. And it's about the decade-long fight to save the International Hotel, which was a low-income housing facility that was home to hundreds of Filipino seniors in San Francisco. And also The Making of Asian America, A History by Erica Lee. And historian Erica Lee tracks waves of Asian immigration to the U.S., beginning with Chinese laborers in the 1850s in California and ending with the Hmong refugees in the 1980s in Minnesota. So another good kind of historical piece to kind of grow your Asian American experience knowledge there. So hopefully those might be some helpful pieces to read.
Awesome. Well, thank you. And I think we can move to Q&A now.
And just for all those titles, I'll get those from Abby. I'll kind of do like a show notes and a follow-up email with all of these recommendations. Yeah, if you have any questions in the room or via Zoom, please use the chat via Zoom and we'll get those read out loud. But if you have any questions for us,
What do you want to know?
you found surprising.
Yeah.
Well, I love what you guys are saying. Thank you for sharing your insights. One thing that I've been thinking about, maybe because of our perspective, my husband and I run a scholarship program that's affiliated with Hispanic family. And we just recently had a conversation about the kids are first gen, so most of the parents are immigrants here. And a lot of the families have such difficulty in sending their kids off to college because their culture just defines really close families. And what I saw in the play was really a conflict in the kids, can't make their way here because of all the microaggressions and the difficulties here. And then they go to China and they have other issues there. So they're kind of displaced. And what is frustrating for me is that you see people, and what makes our country beautiful is the mix of people from different cultures and all of that. And in order to become American, you're giving up a lot of what you get in culture that's ingrained in you. So I just want to ask you guys what you think about, what are you giving up in order to be American? And how does that play into the whole idea of trying to find this equanimity between everyone who's here?
Well, I mean, you don't get to pick where you're born. So you just go with it, right? I mean, you only come to that realization once you understand what culture is, and you make sense of what who you are versus what it means to go back to a place where your family came from, which I have had the privilege of doing. I've gone to India many times. And I think that for me, India, at least when I was visiting as a child in the 1980s, is not the India that it is today, which is a much different, much more, it's more economically stratified, but it's also more vibrant. It was a different time then. So I think that there were more, it was more comfortable here. There were more kind of creature comforts here, but the people there it was much more, it was much warmer, and I missed having that kind of sense of community. So I think everything is a trade-off, right? You're not going to, no place is ideal in any sense. And in either place, you're going to have, there will be FOMO in both places, I think. But I think at the stage that I was growing up, I was also fortunate that there were enough people from South Asia in the United States that I could at least have some semblance of a community here, versus had my family come 100 years ago, there would have been nothing. So I felt fortunate, at least for that.
I think kind of intrinsic to your question, right? The idea that people have to give up things to fit in is really important there, because it puts all the pressure on the minoritized individual to fit in, right? They're the ones who have to adapt. and learn. Like, you know, the author Chung-Rae Lee kind of says that all immigration stories are actually like dystopias, because you have to go to a new world where no one speaks the language, you have to learn all the new habits and eat different food and things like that. So I think, you know, how do we change that, like to create a more accessible, supportive environments, right? Where people don't have to feel like they're the ones who are broken or don't fit in or not good enough. Yeah, so thinking about support for first generation students, if they have more familial responsibilities, like a lot of them have to work to support other people in their family or might have to help out at home and things like that. So how can cognizance about these different cultural contexts be built into what we expect of people as individuals, rather than just sort of being like, oh, it's your job to assimilate. And when assimilation is a really important word in Asian American studies, but it always intrinsically means assimilation into whiteness, right? Like when we don't mean assimilated into Black Americanness. So I think we have to question that intrinsic whiteness to assimilation as well. Other questions?
I apologize if you're already covered this. My observation, this is related to the anti-Asian crimes in the past year or so. So often recommended by people. So I was wondering if there's more history behind that section that you see too.
Yeah, so I think this also is a moment to talk about like misinformation, and that you know, I think that's a concern of the Asian American community, that there's a lot of attention that's being paid towards, you know, a certain community that's committing these crimes, where it actually is true that, you know, there are people of different walks of life that are committing anti-Asian hate crimes and incidents. And so it's kind of, as we're talking about being an ally, and with the holidays coming up, you're having conversations with your family and friends, like when maybe these instances of like misinformation comes up, that one might be a good opportunity to just kind of, like you said, have those kind of more like open conversations and really take that opportunity to try to correct any misinformation out there. And what we're planning on doing also at the Anti-Hate Action Center is going to really kind of focus on that community healing, and really having kind of circles or you know, gatherings where we can talk about that. We can talk about these issues and how communities of color are being pitted up against each other. And it's the time that we need to be, of course, more united and more working together. And at the recent actually summit that the White House had around hate-fueled violence, it was a really good reminder to like that fighting hate really should be done with love, and that we really need to be leading more with love and not fighting hate with hate. And so it's really important when we see all these tragic incidents and crimes happening, that as a community that we're finding opportunities to come together to have these important conversations about how do we process this, how do we process the trauma for these attacks that are traumatizing our communities, and how do we heal, and how do we really, again, take our grief and really put it more into purpose, and how do we really try to find a way to come together to support each other in these difficult times. But yeah, I mean, that is definitely a topic that we want to address in our kind of our conversations and outreach.
I think it's important to remember that white supremacy wins when Black and Asian people are put against each other, right? So if you think about, you asked if there's a history to this, and of course there is, right? If we think about why did we need the Chinese railroad workers in the first place? Because slavery ended, right? So it's directly connected there. I referenced how in the civil rights, after civil rights movement, that also promoted the immigration of Asian Americans then. So at any moment there's Black liberation, Asian Americans have been kind of brought in to be a stopgap. But I think a really important historical example is the LA riots, which is this kind of spectacular moment of Black Asian conflict. The kind of pillaging of Koreatown, and it's important.
1992.
Right.
Yeah.
Important in that moment to think about like why Black Asian conflict is so visible and televised, and like why are the cops in protecting Beverly Hills and not Koreatown, right? So I think when we're thinking about just bodies on a screen on surveillance tape or something like that, not only is the media bias Abby's talking about super important, but thinking about sort of the history of how racial conflict is fomented and to what end. Yeah,
And
so-
especially with that case in 1992, those riots started in response to
To
the
Rodney
verdict
King,
of the
yeah.
Rodney King, the officer who beat Rodney King being acquitted.
Right.
Right? I mean, and that's a white officer, so that there's no attention on that part. But if the attention is on the Black Asian violence.
Yeah. 100%. Thank you. Well, I think that's all we have unless there's anything else, but please feel free to ask us questions
Yeah.
and anything else. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for coming.